Welcome to We're All Mad Here, a podcast aimed at dismantling the stigma surrounding mental health conditions, opening a discussion, and facilitating understanding one story at a time. This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp is an amazing online psychology service, and what makes them different is that all you need to do is answer a few questions online to let them know what you're struggling with, and they'll find you a therapist who's specialized and effective in what you need. No running around or making phone calls or Googling. You can go to betterhelp.com/allmadhere and you'll even get a discount on your first session. I'm joined today by Neal Sideman. Neal sits on the board of the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, the leading organization in the field of anxiety disorders. He has achieved personal success in overcoming panic disorder and agoraphobia, and then went on to craft his very own panic and anxiety disorder recovery program entitled Panic Cure. Since 2002, he's been helping thousands of people to achieve their own recovery. In 2005, his personal story was aired on the Discovery Health Channel series Fires of the Mind. He's here today to speak to us about his success in overcoming anxiety and explain how he helps others do the same. He will walk us through why panic and anxiety disorders are different from everyday nerves. He'll explain how he overcame his own disorder and give us details on the most effective treatments for others suffering from these same conditions. Hi, Neal. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, good to talk to you.
So to begin, would you like to tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and your involvement in the mental health industry in the United States?
Sure. So I have kind of an unusual niche. I help people specifically with panic disorder and agoraphobia. I'm a teacher and a coach. The most effective ways of overcoming these conditions have to do with learning some very specific tools. So what I do works very well over Skype, and I have clients all over the world that come to me to basically take a little one-on-one class from me. Then in a broader way, I'm involved in the field internationally with the leading organization in the field of anxiety and depression is called the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. So that's ADAA. And this is the leading, it's mainly in the U.S., but many members from all over the world. Most of the top researchers are connected with our organization. Many psychiatrists and therapists, people like me that have their own niche in the field. And I've been involved in that organization for, almost 20 years. And then my role in the organization is I co-chair our public education committee, which is concerned with outreach to the general public, outreach to the therapist community, physicians, social workers, people in the helping professions.
So I understand that you have a personal story relating to anxiety and panic disorder. Would you be comfortable sharing a little bit about that with us?
Sure. So this is the reason I got into the field is back in the early 90s. I went through myself a pretty severe version of panic disorder and agoraphobia. And back at that time, it was quite a production to find the right diagnosis. It's much, much better today. So that was the first part of my challenge, was trying to figure out what is going on with me, what's wrong with me, am I the only one on the planet that has this weird problem? And the way I found my path of recovery was I was very fortunate to find out about ADAA. And back in those days, they would actually snail mail a list of members in your state in the U.S. And this is how I found my my therapist who taught me tools. They're called cognitive behavioral tools, or CBT. And I was very fortunate to find somebody that really understood the condition that I had, which is called panic disorder and agoraphobia. And then once I overcame the condition, then I got involved with the organization and I've been active in it ever since, mostly having to do with how do we get these wonderful tools out into the world so that people can benefit from them.
So, some of our listeners have probably never experienced a panic attack or had an anxiety disorder. Can you tell us what makes a panic attack or anxiety disorder different from, say, being nervous before a date or before a test?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so about 1 out of 3 adults have had a panic attack or what I call a panic experience. And for your listeners, if you've had one, you know it. You'll remember it. For everybody else that says, "What are they talking about? Do they mean high anxiety?" The way to understand what a panic attack feels like, if you've never had one, is think of a time that you were really, really anxious, like, being nervous before a date or a test, or public speaking would be a good one. So see if you can think of a time when you really felt high anxiety. And then once you have that in mind, okay, now multiply that by 100. So that's a pretty good estimate of, what does it feel like to have a panic attack? It's a very intense, overwhelming experience. And what's happening in a panic attack is some of your listeners might have heard of the fight or flight response, our ancient survival response that helped us survive back in cave person days. And we call it fight or flight. It was designed to make us into Superman or Superwoman if we were in danger, give us the strength to run fast or fight hard. And so everybody has that survival instinct, and we have the ability to get that instinct triggered if we're in danger to help us. What a panic attack is that fight or flight response gets triggered, but it's a false alarm. And so the internal part of our brain is trying to find the danger to save us so we know what to do. And we get this kind of spiraling kind of internal experience that is called a panic attack. It's very, very scary, but it's really important to know or to learn that it doesn't actually harm us. It's not actually dangerous to us.
And what is agoraphobia?
So most people that get agoraphobia, it starts out with having problems with panic attacks. I'll just tell you my story. So I had a panic attack and I was very worried, and I thought maybe I was having a heart attack, and I went in to see my doctor and he gave me an EKG and everything was okay, but I didn't know what had happened. And then I started having more panic attacks. And then I would wake up in the morning being afraid of having a panic attack. So I'd be anxious most of the day, worried about when am I going to have the next panic attack? Is it going to kill me? So that's called panic disorder. And then agoraphobia is a very related condition having to do with I'm trying to manage my anxiety and panic. So for example, for me, I was driving on the freeway and had a panic attack. And that was a very, very scary experience for me because I didn't understand much about what was happening or whether it was dangerous, which for our listeners, so that to give you some basic information, it's very scary, but it's not dangerous, even if I'm driving on the freeway. But I didn't know that at the time. So I got home and I said to myself, well, I never want to have that experience again. I'm not going back on that freeway. And then I had a near panic on another freeway. So I came home from that and said, well, I'm really going to do a good prevention job this time. I'm not going to go on any freeway. So that pulling back from activities is called agoraphobia. And it's insidious because my problem was not on the freeway. It was inside of me. So no matter how much I restricted my activities, it continued being a problem for me. So what a lot of people think of when they hear the word agoraphobia, they think of someone that doesn't leave their house. And that's true, but that would be like a very extreme form. Agoraphobia just means that there are a lot of activities that I'm not doing because they're triggers for panic for me. And I'm trying to manage the best I can, but now my world is getting pretty small.
So, what kind of therapy program do you use to work with your clients on these kinds of issues?
Yeah, great question. So we are very blessed today if we have one of these anxiety conditions because there are just phenomenal tools that have been developed, mainly in university research, going back close to 30 years now. And a big part of my role with ADAA is to get this information out into the world. The researchers know it, the university researchers know all about it, but we want to get everybody to benefit from these tools. So we have an umbrella term for these tools for anxiety disorders, and we call it cognitive behavioral therapy. And just to translate, now keep in mind this is coming out of university settings, so some of the terminology might sound a little bit intellectual. But to translate it, cognitive just means the mind. Thoughts, images, mental activities. So cognitive is the mind. Behavioral is the body. So cognitive behavioral, a good way to think about it is it's the mind-body approach to overcoming problems with anxiety. And if you think about anxiety say one of our listeners might be thinking about some anxiety issues that they've experienced. And well, we know it's in the mind, but it's very much in the body as well. So it's an approach that brings in a lot of really wonderful creative tools that have been developed. And the way you overcome these conditions is getting a good teacher, number one, and learning the tools that are going to empower you to start overcoming whatever flavor of anxiety disorder you have or that you might be facing.
And what does cognitive behavioral therapy involve exactly? And what is exposure therapy? Because I know that's an element of cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah, yeah. So think of cognitive behavioral therapy, or we call it CBT for short. You can think of it as like an umbrella. It's a general approach that takes into account the mind and the body. And some of the tools are pretty general. One of the tools that we would use for pretty much any anxiety condition is the idea of allowing myself to experience what I'm experiencing. The idea of exposure means that I'm working on facing my fear in a manageable way and in a specific way and with tools to help me do it. But the idea is if there's something that I'm afraid of, and some of your listeners might think of something that applies for them in their life. If there's something that I'm afraid of, and I find a way to expose myself to it in a manageable way, what would eventually happen to my fear over time? And so, for example, let's say that I had a fear of dogs. Maybe I had a scary experience as a kid. And I found a way to gradually face that fear in a manageable way. The first step, maybe I'm going to look at pictures of dogs, of puppies, okay? And then I'm going to pet a puppy or hold a puppy. I just gradually expose myself in a manageable way. Over time, the fear starts to go down. So that's the principle of exposure. And for our listeners out there, just understanding the idea of exposure, you know a lot about CBT now because that's one of the central ideas. Then other aspects of CBT, the tools get very specific depending on what flavor of anxiety condition you're dealing with.
Can you tell us a bit more about what you mean by flavors of anxiety?
Yeah. So for example, The flavor of anxiety that I had is called panic disorder and agoraphobia. Another flavor of anxiety issue that people have heard of, it's been in the news quite a lot, is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So there are some very specific tools for helping us with that flavor. You could think of these as like different flavors of ice cream and different tools that apply depending on which flavor we might have. Another very common flavor of anxiety disorder is called social anxiety disorder, where my life is restricted because of difficulty I have with social situations. Then another one that most people have heard of is called obsessive compulsive disorder. So we call it OCD for short. So there's about half a dozen different flavors of anxiety disorder, and some of the tools are common to all of them, but these CBT tools get very specific depending on what flavor of anxiety issue I'm dealing with.
So, on your website, you state that the two pillars of recovery are education and practice. Can you elaborate a little bit on what you mean by that?
Yeah, so education, I like thinking of when I'm starting recovery, to think of myself as a student. I mean, I'm going to feel like a victim. That's natural. That's normal. And these are miserable conditions. Uh, if I can start to think of myself as a student, it makes it a little bit more manageable. And I might have some good memories of times that I was a student, or maybe I'm a student now in some ways. And the idea of, you know what, the first thing I want to do is let's see if I can learn something about the condition that I'm dealing with. Can I get a diagnosis? Maybe I already have a diagnosis. If not, could I diagnose myself by looking at the ADAA website or Neal's website? Maybe my physician can help me find the right diagnosis. It's important to get that correct diagnosis because depending on what flavor of anxiety condition I have, the tools that are going to help me the most are going to be different. So that's the education part. Learning that I'm not the only one, that, it's me and only about 20 or 30 million other people, facing a very similar condition. So that's really, really helpful to learn. And then when I talk about practice, that's kind of skipping ahead a little bit. Once I am familiar with what is the condition that I'm dealing with, is it panic disorder? Is it OCD? Is it one of the other flavors of anxiety disorder? Then I want to find a good teacher. Maybe I can get a good referral. Your general practitioner, primary care physician might be a good resource to start. And then once I find a good teacher, you know what? I got to do some homework. So that's where the practice comes in. And I can tell you a little analogy about what I'm talking about with what is the role of practice. So let's say that I want to learn to play the piano. And let's suppose that I'm willing to put the time in to practice. Well, if I'm practicing but I don't have very good techniques, I'm never going to get very good at the piano. So it's really valuable to start out with a good teacher, the right techniques for my piano and what is the style is that I want to learn. And now that I've got those good techniques, now I need to put the time in to practice.
So, obviously, when someone goes to therapy for their anxiety, they're going to want to know that the treatment is going to be effective. What kind of evidence is out there about the efficacy of cognitive behavioral therapy and more specifically exposure therapy for anxiety spectrum disorders?
Yeah, great question. So the research evidence is pretty overwhelming that by far the most effective approach for anxiety disorders is CBT. So the evidence is pretty overwhelming. Now, one of the challenges in finding CBT today is a lot of counselors, therapists, social workers have heard the term and have heard that the research supports it, but maybe didn't get that specific training back in their training programs. And so if I don't have a good understanding of what is CBT really, then I might want to be on the bandwagon as a counselor, but maybe there might be something amiss in the CBT that I'm providing. So if you're getting CBT or you think you're getting CBT, CBT is more than just talking about things and having some homework to do. One of the central parts of CBT is the idea of exposure. The idea that I want to find some ways in a manageable way with some good tools to help me to start facing some of my fears. That's called exposure therapy, and that's one of the centerpieces of CBT.
So that sounds pretty uncomfortable, exposure therapy. Is it supposed to be uncomfortable?
Exposure therapy is uncomfortable, and it's also the road to recovery. And it's much less uncomfortable. It's a lot less difficult than suffering with the condition.
So what is something that you've learned through either your professional or personal experiences that you wish that you had known when you first started your journey recovering from anxiety?
I think the first thing that would have been really good for me to know was that the challenge that I was facing was something that I shared with millions of other people, and that it was part of the human experience. There wasn't something wrong with me. It was just, I happened to get this particular condition that millions of people also got.
And does it matter how long you've suffered from anxiety when it comes to how long it will take for the treatment to show improvements?
The research is really surprising on that point. A lot of the research shows that the length of time that we've had anxiety disorder is not much of a factor in how well we do. When I first saw this research, I was surprised because it's kind of counterintuitive. The main factors in how well we do in recovery, two main factors. Number one, finding good CBT. That can be very challenging. Number two is being willing to do some homework. If I do those two, then the length of time that I've had the condition, not really much of a factor.
What does the research suggest in relation to medication as part of a therapy program for anxiety?
Yeah, so there are two main approaches for anxiety disorder, both of which have lots and lots of research and evidence behind them. Number one is CBT, and number two is medication. They work in different ways. Medication, just to generalize, helps about 2 out of 3 people with anxiety disorder. However, just relying on medication is limited because medication doesn't cure these conditions. It doesn't empower me to overcome the condition. It can help me a lot with symptoms. CBT, on the other hand, can actually make it possible for me to overcome the condition that I'm facing. And very often they can work together very nicely.
So if some of our listeners are currently struggling with panic attacks or anxiety or another anxiety spectrum disorder, what would you recommend as one very simple step that they can take to start helping themselves right now at home?
I have 2 very simple steps that I want to recommend. Number one is explore the ADAA website. So that's adaa.org. Many, many wonderful resources there. Free webinars on different topics. Lots of great information on all the different flavors of anxiety and depression. Then the second suggestion is if you think that your particular issue is panic disorder or agoraphobia, then explore my website, which is paniccure.com. That's PANICCURE.com.
And you offer quite a lot of free guides and free information on that website, don't you? It's not all paid. And the ADAA is a not-for-profit organization, is that right?
Right. Yeah, right. Yeah, there's a lot of free information. It's designed to help you get started in your recovery.
What is something that, say that somebody is seeking out CBT therapy, what is something that they can ask their CBT therapist to figure out if that CBT therapy is the type that is efficient for anxiety disorders?
I guess I would ask the therapist what their approach is, and if the therapist is interested in starting out by zooming in on a specific diagnosis, that's a very good sign. If they talk about exposure, that's a very good sign. If they talk about homework being an essential part of the therapy, that's a very good sign. If the therapy is not too concerned about a specific diagnosis and is more, let's talk about your past and your family background, and that can be very useful with a lot of issues, but not much evidence that it's effective in helping you overcome anxiety disorder.
So cognitive behavioral therapy focuses much more on the present and what you're currently dealing with than the past.
Right. That's right. That's right.
Well, thank you so much, Neal, for offering your advice and your opinions and thoughts on all these things. I'm sure they'll be of great benefit to our listeners.
You're very welcome, Geneva.
Bye.
Okay, bye now.